All right, so this is going to be different than previous tutorials where I go through and sort of a scripted process and talk about how to do some very specific things in Photoshop. Instead, on this, what I'm going to do is actually just demo how you guys need to get started on this project. What we've done or what we've talked about up to this point is how to export different PDFs. In this case, I've got 3 different PDFs here from AutoCAD. We've got the ground plane PDF, we've got just the trees by themselves, and then the textures. In this case. And what I'm going to do is open up all 3 of these in Photoshop. Now there's going to be 2 approaches to that. We're going to go to File, Scripts, and Load Files into Stack. I'll browse here, go to our project folder, and I'm going to click the top one, hold Shift, click the bottom one, and open all 3 of these, and then just say OK. We'll let Photoshop sort of do its thing. It's going to stack all these together into a single file and create 3 different layers that represent the 3 different files that are in here. You can see those 3 right here. Now it still keeps the other PDFs open. Not exactly sure why. We don't need them, so we're just going to close these out. So right now I've got this one PSD file. It's got 3 different layers. Those layers are the textures, which you can barely see here. It's got the trees on the layer by themselves and the ground plane on a layer by themselves. That's exactly what we need. Now that doesn't always work for folks. In fact, what you might need to do in this case, I'm going to go to File, Open. For some folks, it seems to skew the image, and I'm just going to go maybe the more traditional route. In this case, we'll just open up the PDF by itself. I'm going to start with the ground plane PDF, and I want to make sure of one thing for certain. It's that the crop to is set to media box. This means that the width is 34, the height is 22. We can leave the resolution at 300. That's going to be great. And I'm going to go ahead and change the mode from grayscale to RGB. Right here. So make sure that when you import a PDF that it sort of sets up like this, and we'll say OK. You'll notice that it opens up just this one PDF. There's just one layer right here. We'll do that for the other 2 files as well. I'm going to open up the trees, making sure that everything looks exactly the same. We'll say OK. And finally for the textures. And OK. Now I need to combine these 3 files into one, similar to how our first one works, right? So if this worked for you, just no need to do the steps that I'm talking about now. If it didn't work for you, then you're going to need to follow these steps. Now I'm going to right click here on this layer and I'm going to duplicate the layer. But instead of duplicating it inside here, if we just click OK, it would create a new layer on top of this. I want to change the destination from this document to this one right here, which is this file that has my ground line work in here. Now it's going to, by default, name it layer 2. I can go ahead and call it my trees line work and hit enter. Now you notice nothing happens right here. If I click in here, you'll notice that I've got a second layer. Now sometimes it's not going to pick up on that layer name, so I'm just going to call it trees line work here by double clicking to rename. And we'll call this one ground line work right here. So right now I've got the 2 files in here just through duplicating those, and I'm going to go do that with the textures as well. We'll right click on this layer and say duplicate layer. Change the destination to this PDF and say OK. Come here, we see that it's called layer 1. I'll just call it textures line work. And I'm going to close out these PDFs. So these are the 2 ways to get to the same end product. To load files in the stack is going to do it a little bit easier, but if it doesn't work for you, you're going to need to do it this way. Whatever the case may be, you want to get to this point right here. Now, for some of you, if you exported from AutoCAD and maybe your viewport moved or something, your trees might be off of where they need to be. Could be that your textures are off or something else is off, and you need to position that stuff. What you'll use is your Move tool. You want to make sure that Auto Select is off. Auto Select, if you click on something, it just selects whatever layer you click on, and if you have a background layer, it's going to screw that up too. So unselect that. That way you just click on the layer that you want to move, and you might have to move this into place and sort of get it as close as possible. Now it's not perfect. The best thing is just to follow the steps that we talked about in class, where you keep that viewport exactly in the same location to the exact scale. You don't move around inside, and you know that that line work is going to plop right on top of where it needs to be. So what I'm going to do at this point, I'm going to close this one out because I don't need any more. I'm going to work just out of this right here. And what I'm actually going to do is go ahead and say File, Save As. I'll save as here, and instead of calling it Untitled 1, I'm just going to go back to my Project 4 folder, and we'll call it Site Plan Rendering. All right, we'll say OK here. And I've got this AutoCAD file exported 3 different layers in Photoshop. I'm ready to start applying base color. I want to do 2 things before I start applying base color. I want to put a background layer in there that just kind of gets rid of these pixels, and I want to rename these layers right here. So I'm going to turn them off, and I know that this is the textures because it's super light. So I'm going to say textures. Click on this layer right here. I know that it's the tree canopy, so I'll say tree line work. It's always good to put line work after it so you can start to separate tree color from tree line work. And then finally here, this is going to be our ground line work. Last thing I need to do is click a new layer here. We're going to call this background, and I want to fill this with the background color. Now, here's how we fill with colors. In this case, I've got black and white right here, and I'm going to click on this. If I hit on my Mac Option Delete, it fills with foreground color. If I hold Command and tap Delete, it fills with the background color. Same thing applies for a PC. It's Alt and Backspace to fill with the foreground color, and it's Control and Backspace to fill with the background color. So tinker with that, whichever one works best for you. I find for me that I always just Command Delete or Control Backspace is just what I like to do. So even if I wanted to fill with black, I would just hit these crosshairs here, or I'd tap X, which flips between them, and Control Delete. Now this does it for any selection that you have, and in this case I don't have anything selected, so it does the entire layer. And so I'm going to hit X and then Control Delete, and now we've got this in here. This is my background layer. I'm going to double check something up here. I'm going to go to Image Mode, and for some reason this will actually do this. And we'll need to make sure, hopefully if you followed the old setup where you just import the files, we changed it to the RGB color, and that's actually what we're going to do here. RGB or CMYK. There's a minor difference. This is more for projectors, this is more for printers, but we're just going to roll with this. It's going to ask if we want to merge all our layers. If we clicked yes, it would actually sandwich all these into one layer. We don't want to do that, so we're going to say don't merge. All right, so hopefully you got to this point. You're all set up, ready to go, and we want to apply some base color. We're going to do every base color on its own layer. So what I'm going to do is actually turn off all these layers and then turn back on the ground line work layer. Create a new layer and call it grass. Then I'm going to get my paint bucket tool, which is G. By default, G is the gradient tool, and so you got to click and hold on the icon, go to the paint bucket tool here. We're going to choose color, say light green, somewhere in here, and just start clicking away. Now it works great where the line work is completely closed in. What you're going to find is that there are some instances where that line work is not closed in. This would be an example of that right here. You notice that it just spills out everywhere. All sorts of examples all over my drawing. Here is another one. So what we're going to have to do is create a temp layer, and I'm just going to say temp. And what I'm going to do is grab a brush. Now we've been using different types of brushes, and so you might need to go to Window, Brushes, and just choose the simplest of the brushes right here. So we'll just grab this one, or you can go to your general brushes and go to hard round. That'll be a perfectly fine one. Now you want to change the size. Remember to use the brackets to make them smaller or larger, or you can do it the long way, which is to click up here and actually move that slider. What I'm going to do is actually draw in a line by clicking and then holding Shift, and I'm just going to drag this across. Now, I was doing something earlier with smoothing, and I have my smoothing bumped up to 100. I typically have that down to 0, so you don't see that sort of magenta line that's trailing behind it. I'll do another run on my Templayer right here to close that off, and I'm going to do this piece across the bottom right here, and then just come this direction right there. So I think I'm closed off for the most part, but I've got a couple areas right here where, you know, my lines don't extend all the way to the edge. So what do I do there? This is where I bumped my smoothing up to 100. It allows you just to draw smoother lines. I'll demonstrate that here. If you have it down to 0 and you just start drawing, it's really only as clean as you can drag your mouse like that, which is fine, but you know, it's a little clunky. So I'm going to jump this all the way up to 100, and you'll notice that it averages your mouse cursor right there, and it gives you kind of a smoother, slightly smoother curve in this case. So I'm going to extend this out and then just use my smoothing to kind of sneak in here, and all I'm doing is providing a boundary. You'll see how this applies in just a second. We'll go back to our grass layer, and I can just keep clicking wherever I've got grass. Now in this case, it's actually a parking lot. I might come back and change this later. You know, there's some quirks in here. Some areas I'm coloring in, they're actually planting beds, and I need to change that. But again, something I'll change towards the end of this process. Again, I know these are planting beds in here, so I'm going to go ahead and not paint those in. I think we're good for grass, at least for now. All right, so I'm done with this. If I turn off the temp layer, you can see that this paint bucket just ran up to the edge of this smooth, so I get kind of this arcing piece right here. I don't need my temp layer anymore, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. I might create some new temp layers down the road, but I'm just going to delete it for now. We'll go and create another layer. We'll call this one planting beds. And I'm going to choose a different color green, slightly darker, and just start paint bucketing in these areas. Now, again, I might decide after the fact, like, you know, this needs to be grass, this needs to be planting beds. Some of these areas I might not be sure. I'm going to actually turn on my textures, and I can see, oh yeah, planting, 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 planting. So turn that textures layer off, and it's just going to help me identify and remind myself where those planting beds actually are. Let's see, turn it back on. Now we're using Logan's file for this, so we might need to reference what he's calling planting bed in here. That's certainly a helpful cause as well. I'm doing this all on the planting beds layer. You want to make sure you're not doing it on the grass layer, you're not doing it on the temp layer. Keeping them all in individual layers is super helpful. So again, I'm going to come back in here, and I want to make these planting. I think I've decided. Might continue. It's almost a design decision at this point. I want planting beds along the road to sort of enclose these lawn spaces. I think that might be a nice touch. All right, we'll continue to add layers. Got a couple fountains in here, so we'll say fountains. Change this to a light blue, put a fountain in here, fountain in here. Got other layers for walls, and I'm going to zoom in to kind of get these walls in here. All right, so let's go gray. And whether you're doing a realistic approach or a diagrammatic approach to your rendering, applying base color is pretty much the foundation for either of these. And in some cases, you might use an image instead of, you know, actually using the texture approach that we're actually going to use later on this project. But in which case, you can still use this layer to help you select the area that where you want to crop out your grass and different things like that. I'm going to go ahead and even create a layer for buildings. Buildings, I kind of know I want them to be really light or even white, so I'm just going to make them a light gray. And this is the case where I've got to turn that temp layer back on. So create a new temp layer. And again, a temp layer is not like a special kind of layer. For me, it is just a layer that is, we call it temp, and we use it just to create these temporary lines in here so that I can actually have something for my paint bucket to run up against. So on the temp layer, here, 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 I'm going to color that piece in as well. Now you notice I got Creswell Hall. It's a layer I forgot to turn off, or maybe the line work was on a different layer. I'm going to go to my ground line work layer. That's where that's at. And in this case, you know, I might mask it out. We'll talk about that at later points, but I know I don't want this in here, so I'm just going to grab my eraser and just kind of erase this. All right, now back to my buildings layer, paint bucket, which is G, zoom out, ready to go, delete that temp layer. Let's keep adding some stuff in here. We'll do the sidewalks. That got away from me. Oh yeah, that Templayer needed up top for these sidewalks. Makes sense. Sometimes that Control-Z is going to be really helpful. So we'll put that in. Probably going to be over here. So I'm clicking and then holding Shift. Notice that sometimes if you, in this case, I'm going to click and then hold Shift and click again, and that just creates a straight line between those two pieces. Another area we need to close this off. Oops. All right, let's see if we can get these sidewalks to work now. Yeah, I think that worked. That did not work. Back to the Templayer, across there, G, sidewalks, got it. Still didn't work. Oh man, keep missing these. So what we're going to keep doing is continuing to click in the sidewalks, put these components in. I'm going to keep adding some additional layers. All right, so I've got to make a few more decisions about what materials I'm going to use. I'm going to need to fill in a few gaps in here that I forgot to include, like this piece of wall and this piece of wall. But I know I want to do aggregate for these surfaces, so I'm going to make another layer. I'm going to call it aggregate. Now you're going to have this temptation to render things the exact color that you see them in reality. And to a certain extent, that's okay. But oftentimes, it's good to study how other people are rendering things. And what you'll find is that, in this case, aggregate, I can do sort of a soft brown color in here, and that might work. Let's see. I'm going to turn back on my textures to see, yep, that needs to be planting. And in this case, I think we're going to make this lawn over here. We'll make this aggregate. Aggregate right in there, and I want to do pavers right in here, so I'm going to make a new layer. We'll call it pavers. Pavers, I'm going to make just a slightly different shade, maybe an orangier shade of this color, and we'll go pavers, pavers, pavers. Ugh, that's a rough color, but I'm going to fix that. I'm going to come back to my planting beds because I know I need to fill in planting beds here, do some planting beds here. But right now, if I'm on the planting beds layer, I can't just click this color. I've got to sample the old color in there. To do that, I'm going to click right here and actually click on that original color. And now I can start painting away with that color. I'll do the same thing for the grass right here. We'll click that, find the grass, and I'll color in there. Not really sure what I'm going to do here. I think I'm just going to do another piece of grass, and we're going to zoom in and do some walls for here and here. Probably need to come in and add a wall so this looks like a raised planter right off the front of this building right here. But let's get back to the walls. You also know that you can notice you can hit I for eyedropper. It's this tool right here, and it will sample the color, and I don't even have to do the color picker, so you might see me do that. It's just a little less clicking, and again, everything I do, I sort of try to find the fastest way to actually make it happen. All right, so we're getting close here. Let's do I again, get that grass color, and go to the grass layer. You always got to make sure you're clicking on the right layer, and there'll be some ways that you might screw up and you might start painting shrubs on the grass layer. A couple different ways to fix that. You can just erase from that layer. So if I turn off all these layers right here, I can just, if I wanted to make this planting bed, I could just erase that. There's different things that you can do. Some more advanced tricks like select color range will allow you to select certain colors on a layer. You could use your wand to select areas, holding down shift to do multiple selections. So wand is just W. And then once I've got those selected, I can just hit delete, back out of that. And so you'll find that there are little tips and tricks to turning stuff off when you accidentally do it on the wrong layer. Let's do pavers over in here. So I'm gonna hit I, grab that, let's go to my pavers layer, hit G, paint bucket in. All right, How do we change colors in here? Let's say I feel good about everything and you delete the temp layer, but maybe I'm not in love with the grass and I want to change that color. What I'm going to do is control click on the grass layer icon, not the grass layer icon. All right, it's going to put a marquee around everything on that layer, even the stuff that's on that layer and underneath my shrubs right here. So it puts a marquee around all of it. I need to click on that layer, make sure I've got that selected, and what I'm going to do is select a different color. We'll start with this base color, but I'm going to make it a little lighter and I don't know, just a couple changes to it. At this point, what I'm going to do, if you remember back to our very first start, if we do on a Mac, it is Option Delete, it fills with a foreground color. Command Delete fills with background color, which in this case is white. So I want to do Option Delete to do with this new green color. I can keep sampling different colors, keep trying different approaches to it. On a PC, it's going to be Alt and Backspace to fill with the foreground color. So, and Control Backspace to fill with the background color. Remember that you hold down the Alt button and you just tap Delete or tap Backspace in that case. We mentioned about, do you actually color things the actual color of that they are in reality? If that were the case, I would make a roads layer. I need to make a temp layer to close off my roads. Right, like that, right here. Oops. Right here, here, here. Why am I redoing this each time? I'm not really sure. On the roads layer, that's the temp layer right there. I'll go back to the roads layer. Roads, primarily asphalt, asphalt, primarily dark gray. And you'll notice, man, that is abrasive. And so I don't want to do that on here. It dominates the rendering. It's a little bold. I could tone it down and make it a gray, like a darker gray. And sometimes that works. This might work. I can make it a really light gray, but now it just kind of looks like concrete. And so a lot of renderings you'll see keeps it white. Perfectly fine. What you can do is I can keep this on. I might turn it up to this darker, but I'm just going to turn that layer off for now, just because I think I like the white on here. All right, let's talk about a couple other things. Obviously, fill in some details, blah, 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 blah. All right, what about the trees? We've got the tree line work here. Why is it not showing up? Well, because it's below all of the color layers. So I'm going to actually move it up to the top. And the other thing that I'm probably eventually going to do is multiply all of these color layers right here. But putting the trees at the top, and we are going to turn off everything but the trees. Then going to create a new layer called Tree Color. And it's really important to put your color on a separate layer from line work. These line work layers are sacred. Don't mess with them. In this case, I'm going to grab my wand tool and I'm going to click outside of the trees, select hopefully everything outside of it. Then I'm going to go to inverse this selection, which now it is selecting everything inside of that. And I'm going to fill with a tree color that I'm just going to choose as a kind of a darker green here. Option Delete to fill with that foreground color. Great, filled in all these trees, looks wonderful. I'm happy, except for it didn't fill in these trees. Why didn't it fill in those trees? If I look closely, you'll notice that it did, it just filled in the outline, and it's because when that wand came through, it actually got inside of this tree. And so I've got to go one step further, and this is how it's going to work. I'm just going to grab B for brush. I'm going to go back to my brushes, and I'm just choosing a general brush, this hard round brush right here. And what I'm going to do is seal off these areas where there are holes. All right, now this is going to take a little bit of time. See where I'm going, because next I'm going to grab my paint bucket, making sure all layers is checked, and I'm just going to do that right there. Ooh, now these brushes, this did some weird stuff. Why did it do that? Well, when I hit B for brush, for some reason my flow of the brush is set to 70. I need to bump that back up to 100. And now it's actually going to be 100% of that brush color. And so I can do this here. I got to be careful because each time I notice I'm leaving a little piece right here. So when I click this, I'm always going to have to click this. So maybe there's a more strategic way to do it. If I just make the brush a little smaller, perfect, like that. Now when I can do this. You also notice that it has a little glow around it. Just click again, gets rid of that glow where that is. This is going to take a little bit of time, like I said, but it's going to be worth it. It's going to do a drop shadow. It's going to look spectacular, at least the first time you do it. then you'll be bored by it. And this is kind of how tutorials work when I'm talking to myself. All right. So just continuing to click around, finding all the areas to close. And what we're going to talk about in the future is actually you don't have to use the AutoCAD trees. We can scan in trees and then actually bring them in and use them in Photoshop in place of these sort of rigid AutoCAD trees. So scan in hand-drawn trees and bring them in. Might be the same case. You're just going to have to color them in on their own layer, fill them in, you know, that line work where you picked up your pen and left a gap. That's good drafting technique, but it's not the easiest for filling in with the paint bucket. So we're getting close, almost there. And I think we're done. All right, make sure I got this one. Yep. So what I'm going to do is zoom out, grab my paint bucket. I'm going to click twice because I know I need to get rid of that little ghosting around the circle. All right, so we've got the trees. Let's actually turn all our layers back on, turn off our roads because they're ugly. And what do we need to do about the tree color now going over the line work here? Well, we can put it underneath, that works. That's one option. We can multiply, but now when we multiply, we start to see all the different ground planes underneath, and that's a good effect. We might actually like that. So you got options here. You can do multiply, or you can do normal and just move it below the line work. Let's zoom in because there's a couple other things that are trouble. When we wanded outside and we inversed, it didn't get these little gaps in here. So what I'm going to do is use my wand tool. W is for wand. We will hold down shift the whole time while I'm clicking, and it clicks all those spots in between. Zoom out. There might be a few other instances like that. We'll come over here, wand, shift click. Once I get them all selected, make sure I'm on the tree color layer and just hit delete. Sort of watch it go away right there. And then deselect through Command D or Control D, and we can deselect all that right there. So now we've got our base color, we've got our trees colored, and we've made a huge dent in this rendering right now. We might start to get to a point where we're pretty happy with it. The last thing that I want to do tree color wise is go to edit. No, I don't. I want to go to right click and blending options. The blending options, this is where we're going to start to do a lot of stuff to these layers. We can start to add textures and do some different techniques to them. The one that I'm going to do that's perfect for trees is drop shadow. We'll click on drop shadow. You got to make sure you don't just click on the check. Sometimes we'll just click on the check, but it doesn't bring you to the panel. You got to actually click on the word. And you'll notice that you can create custom shadows in here. Let's look at some of the sliders. The blend mode is multiply. You want to keep it at that. It basically just multiplies the shadow to stuff underneath. We've got the opacity of it. Leave it at 35 for now. We've got the distance of it. You can see as I move the slider up, the shadows get longer. You got the angle right above here, so you can just point the direction. A really cool thing that you can do is you can actually click and hold in here and it adjusts the distance and the angle. So I'm going to drop it this direction, to the bottom right. Some people like to put them on the top, you know, put them towards the north because that's a truer way of doing it. Some people like to put them on the bottom side because it makes it sort of feel like they are anchored on the page, that they're not like sliding off the page. So whatever the technique is, put it in that particular angle. You can see you can play with the spread of it, which you really start to notice when you zoom in a little bit on these textured ones. You can see how the spread changes this edge right here, and the size does the same thing. From a low size is a very crisp shadow. You can see a large size is a very blurry shadow, and so I still like to a certain degree that level of crispness. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I'll leave it up just a little bit. Now, one thing that we talk about with hand graphics, so I'm just going to click back on drop shadow, click OK here, and zoom out. I'm using Control or Command 0 to zoom all the way out. One thing we talk about in hand graphics is, you know, use multiple colors in things. You know, not everything is the color that you grew up drawing it as a kid. Trees have shades of purple, and you know, there's all oranges and brown pavers and things like that. So even in my drop shadows, what I'm going to do is change the color right here. So we're going to click on this, and I always change it to kind of this deep purple color. There's just something about that. A lot of people will either use a deep purple, they'll use a deep orange, which kind of gives it a warm feel. And so we'll use that right here, and maybe even bump the opacity up, do some different things like this. One other great thing that I really like about doing tree shadows, even once I've got the color down, you can turn down the opacity of the layer, and it turns down the color of the tree. It makes it a little more transparent, but as you turn down the opacity, and I'm just clicking on the word opacity and dragging over, it turns down the blending option as well, meaning that the shadow in this case is going away. So I'm going to bump that all the way back up. What you'll notice is you turn down the fill, it turns down the color, but it doesn't change the blending option. This is most obvious when you turn it all the way down to 0, and you see that the color is completely gone, but the shadow is still there, and that can be a really helpful technique when setting up these renderings. The last thing I'm going to end with is we're sort of getting started with this. We're going to transition into some more textures and techniques. Is this idea of overlay layers. So I'm going to turn this down a little bit, and I'm going to zoom in and create a grass overlay layer. So right above my grass layer, I'm going to call it grass overlay. And what I want to do is put a little bit of texture around the edge. Like when you're using markers, your pen goes slower at the edges and faster towards in the middle, and then slower at the end. And by default, it kind of creates a deeper color on the edge than it does in the middle. Additionally, you might come back and you texture, or you might stipple around the edge. But in the end, typically around the edges, you have a slightly darker shade in there. And so what I want to do is replicate that through an overlay layer. I've got this grass overlay right here. I'm going to grab a brush. I'm going to hit B for brushes. I'm going to come over to my brushes right here. And as we talked about in class, I want to load the legacy brushes. If you haven't done that already, you need to click here, click on legacy brushes. It opens up this folder right here. We'll open up these legacy brushes. We've got wet media up here, but we want to, inside the legacy brushes, go down to wet media at the bottom. And we want to find Drippy Water, my favorite brush in here. And so Drippy Water is set to 9. I need it slightly larger. And I'm just going to test the size of it right here. All right. And you can see I'm starting to darken up the edge way too dark. Additionally, it's below the Sidewalks layer, so you can see that when I was doing that, I was actually putting it right here. I'm going to drag the Sidewalks back up, but I want to keep it on the grass layer. I don't want it to spill, anywhere out into space. So what I want to do is, I'm actually doing this on the Sidewalks layer, which is a mistake. I'm going to come back to the grass overlay layer, and I want to do this, but I want it to stay contained within the grass layer. So to do that, I am going to hit Control A and delete, so I can delete everything on my grass overlay layer. And then I'm going to Control click on my grass layer right here. I'm going to turn everything else off just so you can see how this is working. But it has put a marquee around my grass layer. I'm still on my grass overlay layer, and when I paint or brush out here, nothing happens. When I brush in here, it shows up. All right. So let's actually make this thing do what we want it to do. Turn all my layers back on just so I can kind of see what's happening. I'm on my grass overlay, and I want to just kind of paint around the edge. And don't want to be perfect, just kind of darken up right here. Even on these walls, I kind of want to darken up a little here. Now you can see I just grabbed any color. I used a green that was the same green that I used for the tree, which is frankly a little heavy. And not frankly, it actually is. I mean, it's just bluntly. I don't know. I think I used that wrong, but you get the idea. I'm going to actually put a little bit at the base of the trees. I tend to do that as well. I would continue to do this for all areas of the grass. We're sort of tracing in here. You kind of want it to hang a little bit over, and you always want it to butt up to the edge. You don't want to do something like this. You want to kind of run along the edge and have it be 100% solid on that edge. And so you might change the size of that brush a little bit as you go, but you want to be somewhat consistent. Put a little bit of it underneath the trees here. You'll find some different techniques. Study some renderings, especially the hand-drawn renderings. I mean, that's what I'm trying to mimic with this approach right here. Just kind of dumping this underneath. All right, you get the idea. Now, I'm leaving it really dark right now for a couple reasons. So I can see where I've done this. That's the main reason. But I'm not really worried about it, because what I'm going to end up doing is turning down the opacity and really controlling this overlay layer. All right, so you get the idea. I'd sort of finish this out for the rest of my project site, just to kind of give that overlay. It looks terrible, but once we turn down the opacity, you're going to notice that it really can be sort of a subtle texture that's on there. It kind of mimics that hand-drawn approach, and even a watercolor approach. So I've got mine down to 9, which is tiny. Really, the more of the tell is how it prints out. So you might have it down to 17, looks a little dark here, but it prints out light, or you might have it at 8, and it prints out a little darker than you plan. Do a test print, see how it works out. I'll continue to do that overlay layer for the planting beds, for pavers, for the sidewalks even. I wouldn't do it for the buildings. Just let them sort of be a solid piece unto themselves. We'll talk about buildings at a later date. Sometimes we'll even leave those white, just to kind of show this final piece. I said that was going to be the last thing. I actually want to show one thing just while I'm doing a video. It's going to be something we talk about later on in classes, and it gets a little further down the road, but how to do building shadows. I'll probably do a separate tutorial for this, but might as well include it now. I want to create a building shadow, and it might seem like the obvious thing to do is to create a drop shadow right here. When you do that, you get the floating building, right? It's like a roof line that's floating, and it ends up not showing this line that needs to be right here, or in this case, this line that needs to appear right here. You still would have that shadow here. When we would draw the shadow in, it would come down this direction, and then continue along this path, and then kick back in these corners right here. So this is a problem. We can't really use this drop shadow. It looks goofy. It works great for trees, but it looks not great for the building. So we're going to hit cancel out of that. And what I'm going to do is create a buildings shadow layer. Call it buildings shadow. I'm going to control click the buildings layer. So I've got all that selected. I'm still in the building shadows layer. I'm going to hit D to color it in with my default colors, and Option and delete, or Alt and delete. All I've done is just filled in my buildings on a separate layer called building shadows, and I made them black. Now I'm going to hit Control T. We're going to go down and to the right using the arrow keys on my keyboard. I'm hitting down and to the right. All right. I hit Enter to commit to that Control T. That is the free transform tool, and we've moved the shadow down and to the right. Now I did it twice just to re-emphasize that, so I'm going to do it again. I'm going to go Control T, down 1 and over, and I only want to go down 1 and over 1 once. You're doing it in the direction of the shadow. We'll hit Enter to commit to that transform. Now on a PC, you're going to hold Control Alt Shift, and then you're going to tap T a bunch. On my Mac, I'm going to do Control or Command Option Shift, and I'm going to tap T. Notice the first time I do this, it repeats that same transform, but it puts it on a second layer, and it calls it Building Shadow Copy. If I keep tapping T, you're going to notice it's going to stress out my computer for a little bit, but once my computer catches up, it's basically sending a duplicate of that transform down and to the right. We'll let it catch up. It's done it about 16 times, 17 times, and it's moved it down to the right. Now, in some cases, all of this is kind of below other line work, so it's not showing up great. I'm going to do it, we'll say 3 more times. And I've got all these layers together. I'm going to highlight all the layers by clicking on the top one, all the layers that are the building shadow, that is. Holding Shift, clicking on the bottom, right click, and merge layers right here. Control E or Command E is the shortcut for merging layers. So what I've got now is basically, and I'm going to pull this up to the top, I've got a building that is duplicated and run down a bunch of different, down and to the right a bunch of times to, and then merge together. So it's just one massive blob with like more blobs down to the bottom right. All right, let's see how this actually works. I'm going to click back on my buildings layer, and then I'm going to delete that from the building shadow layer. You can see right there it did create what looks like a shadow. It forced in that line right here, which is really helpful. Makes it not feel like a floating building. And there's some issues down here. It kind of, this isn't how it works. That's just off the page. So I might grab my marquee and just highlight and delete. Same with over here. And so there's some areas to repair, and I actually think it needs to be even taller because the buildings are taller than my trees. So I'd go through that process again and add a few more. We'll turn the opacity down just to get it to be pretty subtle. All right, at this point you can start to see how the base colors are coming together. You're starting to build the framework for your Photoshop rendering. And we're not going to do all of these things. You don't need to be everywhere or all the way to this point by our next class period. In fact, having the base line work in and those 3 layers that we've worked on, applying the base color to all the different layers and sort of having your drawing set up like this is great. Our next step is really to add in these textures, to add in tree color and put drop shadows, add in building shadows, and sort of finish this thing out. We'll add in details like textures for the pavers and maybe even some people and cars, things like that. Replace some of the trees with hand-drawn trees, or even do an overlay layer for the trees to darken up the bottom right sides of these trees to sort of reinforce that even more, the sort of conical shape of the tree. So follow these steps. Hopefully this is helpful. This is certainly informal, but I hope it gives you a leg up on working on your renderings for this class, for future classes. You can always fall back on this and use it as a resource. So good luck on your renderings. Hopefully get to this point and take them 10 miles further, make some great work, and look forward to seeing it.